Here I do a quick review of stored procedures in MySQL and go through an example. When we have frequently used processes, we're going to do something usually important for the organization, and we'll repeat that. It's a good idea to save a stored procedure. What stored procedures do, which is a chunk of code, it connects to the database, sends instructions in form of a query to fetch data from the database. We'll do a process, the process we want, and then return the results. The results can be in form of changing, updating, or adding records to the database, or showing something for the user interface. When the program runs, a stored procedure connects to the database and will be fetching data from one or more tables. And the data fetched into the program, they need a place while waiting for processing. Those values must be stored somewhere, so we need to declare variables. Variables can store a single value or the values of the entire field or the filtered field that is returned to the program waiting for processing. And of course, the variable types we declare in the program must match the data types of those fields that we are fetching data from. For creating and sending the query to the database, we need an object called a cursor so that you can send the query to the database and then keep the values in the cursor, and then we can extract the values of different fields from that, storing them into the values, the parameters that are going to be processed. So we fetch the data from cursor into those declared variables, and we have to plan ahead before sending the query to the database. So we need to plan on the number of variables, what we're going to store in them, and then send the query to the database, store the values, fetch the values from cursor into the variables, and do the process. Well, doing the process often involves going through a loop. That means, for example, if you have 10 rows of data and you're going to process them, you need to create a loop to look at those values one by one and then do the process and return the results one by one. So that loop is required. One example of the loop is a while loop. While one condition exists. So that condition could be end of the column when there's no data recorded, while that condition is met, or a value will be reaching to a limit. That could be a condition. Then do something. Between do and end of the while, we can create the code for processing. Could be different things. Now I go to the workbench and start a stored procedure. So clicking on add stored procedure will create a new stored procedure, and the overhead code is created. We type everything between these two, begin and end. There's a default name. We'll change that to what we want. I will call this ranking. And the plan is to retrieve the difference of receive date and order date for each merchandise order and rate it. So we consider 5 different levels. Delivery was agile. If that was less than 10 days, it was early, below 20 days, normal, late, and extremely late. Well, these are as the delivery is later, the difference of order and receiving is longer, then we can add different response and then return the result as a message, show to the user. So what we're going to return from the database is just a difference, one value. So we need to create one variable for storing that value, and then after processing we need one variable for storing the result and then passing that as a message. We start with creating the variable. So the variable for calculation is created, declare the name of the variable as integer. The difference of the days, two dates, is stated as integer, so we create this as an integer. And then we need one variable for storing the result. We're going to return a string as the result. Next step, we create the query, selecting the difference of those two dates into the variable we created for storing the result. From table merchandise order, where purchase order number equals 1. Here I pass just one value manually to keep it simple. In the next procedure we'll see how we can create a loop to go through the entire result set. So this will be the query, fetching the data from database, storing the result for that particular purchase order into one value, one variable. Next step, we create a case statement. Between the case, start of the case and end case, we can put down different conditions one by one, selecting a string based on the value of the variable we have. So the first one will be if delivery variable is 10 days or less. And that's the syntax. When the variable for delivery, what we stated before on top, as an integer, and then we stored the value returned from the database into this variable. That number, if that's equal to or less than 10, then select the string agile, into the result variable, and with semicolon, and go to the next. We can state other conditions, and just like the first one, 20 and less, 30, 45, and then here, if delivery is more than 45 but less than 100, then select extremely late. That's another way we can state the case result into a variable for result. And then we do have else at the end. That means if the value does not fit any of that criteria, then select unacceptable, which means if the value is more than 100 or more. And then that's the end of the case. The last statement, select that variable result, one of those values from the case stored in it, as message. It means show it to the user. Now go click on apply, review the code, and apply. Now that stored procedure is created in ACD, which is the current database. Go find it. Rankings. That's the stored procedure we have. And we can call this by clicking on the second icon. This comes out as early, and this is the code that calls it. In fact, in any query, if we type call database name dot stored procedure name and parentheses, well, this is the independent. If that's the middle of the query, we just have that statement, and it will return the result. Now for the next step, I'm going to add one column to the table merchandise order. Alter table merchandise order, add a column as delivery, a variable character 20 characters long. We could do it using the visual interface as well. Run the query. And after running this query, we can check the table and see if the column is added. Of course, the code down here is telling us that it's done. Merchandise order. You can see the column of delivery is added and the values are null. Now it's ready to create the next stored procedure. In this stored procedure, we're going to rate all those merchandise orders. So we need to return all of them, process them one by one, and then return the result to the database this time. I call this one the loop ranking, since we're going to use a loop. And start here. Since we're going to process the results one by one, then we need more variables. We need one variable to store the purchase order number, because we're going to associate the results with each purchase order number. One variable for order date, one for receive date, and one for storing the results. We also need to use an error handler or exception handler. Exception handler is used in program to handle the situations where there's an exception or error. For example, when we're going through a list, end of the list, if there's no value, there's an exception. If we don't handle that, the program will issue an error and stops. Use a handler here as well. So we start with the variables. Of course, the purchase order number says that's a number, integer, well, it's the same type. Both order date and receive date are date type, and the variable that controls the error handler as integer. Controls for error handler could be 0, 1 as well. We need to store the results for the supplier rating, and then one variable for storing the difference of those two order dates. We need a cursor. When we send a query to the database, return the results multiple columns, we need a data structure for that. So that's our cursor. We declare a cursor, put down a name for that, for the query. That's a simple query, just fetching results from the entire table of merchandise order. Then we declare a continue handler for not found. Well, these are all keywords of the system. What continue handler does, when the query hits a null value, that means end of the results, the program will not crash. It will continue, go to the next. So we defined a variable for this. This variable is var and rows. We define that as tiny integer, could be 0, 1, which of course equals to true or false. These are equal. So if the value of that is true, the continue handler works. If that's false, then it quits the process. So what we need to do in order for the continue handler to continue working, let the program to go ahead, is setting that value to true. It'll be true when it hits the end of the rows. It will change to false, and then the program will continue. The handler will be active. Now we are ready to start processing, fetching the data which is stored in the cursor into the three variables we defined, declared on the top, for purchase order number, order date, and delivery date. Fetch from that cursor into these three. Now that's the time to start processing. First step, we open that cursor that stores the results from the query. Since we're going to process the results one by one, we have multiple rows. That's the time to start a loop. We can start a while loop. Starts with while that variable of end rows, that variable that works with the error handler, is false. We just set it as true. Then do. Of course, we have to consider and while. When the process ends, we type everything for the processing of the data in between within the loop. So these are the steps that we do for processing the data. First, fetch the data from the cursor that we just opened into the three variables we declared at the beginning for purchase order number, order date, and delivery date. After these values are fetched, we start processing them. Similar to the previous example, use a query here, selecting the difference of those two into the variable, the difference, where the purchase order number equals that variable we return from the cursor, purchase order. This query actually processes only one row because we have just one number active here. Then we start our case statement, quite similar to what we did for the previous example. Case comparing the value that we haven't had in this step of the loop and see which criteria it will match and return the same string. End case, the value is already stored in the result variable. Next, we update the table. But one result for one of the rows, then update merchandise order table, set the delivery, the new column we created, equal to the result variable, the string that returned from the case statement, where purchase order number matches the purchase order that is being processed. We are doing this one by one. And that's the end of the loop. We'll return to the beginning and we'll start processing the next value. After ending the loop, we're at the end of the processing. When all values are done, now we need to close the cursor. Just close the name of the cursor, put down the semicolon, and that's the end of the program. Now we apply changes, which means create the stored procedure. So if we go to ECD stored procedures, that's the stored procedure we have created. So we can click on call, or just create the code for call. The code is executed. Then we can go to the table and see what happened to all those null values in merchandise order. Delivery column, all deliveries are ranked.